I'm Mini Kapoor, Ideas Editor with the Hindu newspaper, and we're sitting here with Srinath Raghavan, historian, on the sidelines of the Hindu Huddle. Srinath, we just spoke about Indira Gandhi, the many facets of Indira Gandhi, her legacy. So I was just wondering if if you could just lead into how definitive the 70s were. You're working on a book. Your next work is on history of India during the 70s. And perhaps we could start with something you said earlier about how we need to see the 70s as a long 70s. It starts in the late 60s and leads into the 80s. Why do you categorize it like that?
Well, I think actually our discussion kind of brought it out quite clearly, right? Which is to say that, in a sense, if you want to understand and get the measure of someone like Indira Gandhi, the times are at least as important as the person. And in that sense, we need to get. And I think the long 70s, as I sort of try and frame it, are important because, if you start at the period from 1967 onwards, right? That's the period when the Congress Party's decline really begins. They lose the first time when they are sort of out of power in some very important states. And then Mrs. Gandhi, of course, goes on to break the party. And then there is a transformation, there's an upswing, and then there's a downswing, right? Leading right down to the emergency. But this is also a period when she sort of initially adopts very sort of socialist policies. There's a sort
of huge mandate.
Absolutely, right? There's this whole sort of Garibi Hatao program and so on. But then you are confronted with this massive sort of economic crisis, which comes as a result of the sort of global oil shocks, which only goes to tell you that the phenomenon of globalization is already sort of playing out even at that point of time. And that then sort of knocks the socks out of the Indian economy, puts politics into a tizzy, gives rise to the rise of the Navnirman movement, which is the main opposition to Mrs. Gandhi, and culminates in the emergency. So I think, and then if you look at the period after the emergency, the similar problems are there. I mean, we tend to forget, everyone assumes that Janata government was this sort of cacophonic coalition. They just couldn't pull together, all of which is true to some extent. But let's also not forget that there was a second oil shock in 1979 because of the Iranian Revolution. The year 1979 is when Indian GDP registers negative 5% growth. It's the sharpest drop in 20th century India's economic history. And that benefits Mrs. Gandhi at that point of time, right? So she's both a beneficiary and someone who faces the constraints of this decade. So which is why my project really is to look at the decade with her, of course, as one of the important dramatis personae of the time.
And we've discussed Indira Gandhi a lot, and we will again in the course of this conversation. What is the Janata government? Where do you place them in India's history here? I mean, even in, regionally, they opened up to China, to a bit, to Pakistan.
That's right.
So where would you...
Well, I think March 1977 really is the finest moment in India's democracy. I think that's the first time that we have a change of power in a serious way. An incumbent election government loses and gracefully makes the way for an opposition to take power. And that, I think, is not a transition which is to be underestimated. I mean, you only need to look at any American election when it happens, right? A peaceful changeover of power. They've been around for what, 1776 onwards. Here we are talking about it happening in the first time, when the people take a very clear call that this was a government that they are no longer willing to sort of extend their mandate to. She's given an unequivocally sort of defeated, and then she seeks power, which I think was a very important moment of Indian democracy coming into its own. So I think that itself, the mere fact of the formation of a government like that was a very important thing. What were their accomplishments? The second reason I think the Janata government was important was precisely what you're saying, right? I mean, in terms of foreign policy, they made a number of interesting and somewhat counterintuitive sort of initiatives, right? You have Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was sort of, made a career for himself as a young parliamentarian, envying against China's sort of land grabs against India, actually becoming the first foreign minister to visit since Jawaharlal Nehru in 1954, literally. And opening up with China happens. There's also a recalibration of relations with the United States. We tend to forget that President Jimmy Carter actually came to India, met with Morarji Desai, gave something called the Delhi Declaration, which was quite important. There were other initiatives in the region, and so on and so forth. So I think the Janata government was an interesting exercise, but the internal contradictions were very strong. Not just in terms of personalities and what they wanted to do, but the kinds of policies they wanted to favor. So someone like Charan Singh was very clear that you needed to have much more of an economic policy focused on the countryside, right? So Charan Singh has this sort of image of India as urban India versus rural India, right? And in that context, he believed there's a need for a great diversion of resources towards rural India. But all of this attempt is happening in the context of another renewed economic crisis, which then makes it impossible for that coalition to work out. But I think it's still, as a historian, I think it's an exercise worth examining on its own, rather than simply seeing it as a parenthesis between two phases of Indira Gandhi's career.
To stick with the Janata government a bit more, this is when we see Mandal today's, which is still playing out our caste politics, and of course now you have the pushback with the 10% quota. So, where would you place it in the Janata government? Well, you see the seeds right there.
Yeah, but again, if you go back to the 1967 election, right? I mean, the key thing, and part of the reason I would say that the 1970s really begins in 1967. Is because the 1967 election is an interesting one where there are significant defection of social groups from the Congress party, right? I mean, to give you one example, Charan Singh, who's the leader of the Jats and of other what you might call as OBC but somewhat smaller landowning communities in Uttar Pradesh, actually leaves the Congress party and forms his own party, which then results in the defeat of the Congress party, right? That's a very significant moment. For Uttar Pradesh is the sort of heartland even back in the day. And for the Congress to sort of lose the support of such an important agrarian community was not a joke. Then you see the rise of various kinds of groups which come together under the JP umbrella of what you might call as OBC politics, right? I mean, if you fast forward to Mandal and think of all the iconic figures there, Lalu Prasad Yadav, Nitish Kumar, everyone to the T had their sort of political baptism in the sort of Navnirman movement, which was a movement against this. So you already see that there is a change in the character of Indian democracy, where what you might think of as the sort of more depressed lower orders, who were previously in a much more hierarchical caste-wise relation, voting for the Congress party, now thinking that listen, we have to sort of start thinking for ourselves, finding our own political vehicles through which we want to form groups. And that I think is a very, very significant deepening of Indian democracy. Which is also one of Indira Gandhi's contributions to this country, which is that on the one hand she attempted to sort of destroy the institutional basis of Indian democracy, but on the other hand her policies meant a deepening of democracy in a sense of enabling other groups to understand that this empowers them, and that is what they understood and took it forward.
And this is a fanciful thought, but also wasn't finally when she defeats the Janata Party, it starts in 66 and 67 when she's breaking out of the syndicate's hold. And finally she defeats, that's the end of Morarji's career. And that's the last fight.
Absolutely. And in some sense, I mean, some of the Congress old guard really, by that point of time, are this thing. But again, the 1980 election is again a good reminder that the Mrs. Gandhi who comes back to power is not quite the same sort of person who sort of came back to power in 1971, right? She needs a very different kind of political economy to keep her party in power. She's much more supportive of big business, incumbent groups in particular, right? So you have the license permit Raj, but the license permit Raj works in ways that benefits certain kinds of players in the sort of political economy rather than others. What she faces in the third sort of phase in her career in the 1980 to 84 period, I think are consequences of some of the actions which she took earlier. For instance, this whole attempt at centralization, not just of the Congress party, but of Indian politics as a whole, results in a significant backlash, right? I mean, pretty much all the regional assertion movements that you see from 1980 onwards, whether it's Punjab, whether it's Assam, whether it's Andhra Pradesh, all of them have their significant specific problems. But in a structural sense, the over-centralization which Mrs. Gandhi attempted in the first sort of part of her prime ministerial career, this was a natural backlash to some of that stuff. And she had to accommodate herself to different kinds of forces. Again, you think of a state like Tamil Nadu. Already by 1967, Mrs. Gandhi understands that now there is a much more powerful force by the name of DMK which is out there. So when 1971 elections come up, she's already in an alliance with the DMK. In an alliance where they are conceding significant amount of seats in a seat-sharing arrangement to the DMK. In 1977, because she falls out with Karunanidhi during the emergency, she actually has a tie-up with ADMK with MGR, which then continues through for the rest of the period. So she has to accommodate to new political forces. So, Indira Gandhi of 1980 is not the Indira Gandhi of 1971.
Throughout her career, even when she was in Lucknow living, she would write letters to Nehru alerting him about the RSS, the growth of the RSS. She was very clear, on the Sangh, and but the Sangh never criticizes her wholesomely. They criticize, they talk about dynasty, they criticize Nehru, they criticize Rajiv, but what is this? I mean, the fascination. What fascinates the Sangh towards her?
It's an interesting question because For instance, if you look at this person who got the Bharat Ratna recently, right? He was Nanaji Deshmukh. Nanaji Deshmukh was one of the leaders of the Sangh during the sort of Navnirman movement and the post-emergency, the sort of mass movement that the RSS tried to organize. A lot of them went to jail and so on and so forth, right? So there is this clear antipathy. Their politics is sort of against her. But there are some issues on which someone like Nanaji Deshmukh sort of finally had to give ground to her, right? Ultimately, when Mrs. Gandhi dies, Nanaji Deshmukh sort of eulogizes her as saying that whatever it was, she prized national unity more than anything else, right? The fact that she could split Pakistan into two, those were things that they were willing to sort of do. And again, it's a reasonably well-known fact that in 1981, when there were local elections in Delhi, the RSS actually felt that she was a better candidate than the Bharatiya Janata Sangh at that point of time, which was going through a bit of an internal disarray on its own. So I think there is that kind of a fascination with her as someone whom they had taken on at some point of time, but who was still very strong, but who in some ways represents a kind of muscular nationalism which they wanted, right? But from her side, I think it was, as you were saying quite rightly, the view was very clear from the very beginning. And in fact, I think that was one of the significant drivers for the imposition of the emergency, was because she believed that these forces were taking control of the Navnirman movement, which was true. JP's foot soldiers were predominantly from the RSS. And she ended up sort of imposing the emergency because she believed that these were forces which are going to get out of control. So that was one of the considerations there. But the paradox, of course, is that the group which gets maximum sort of mileage out of the emergency is the RSS, right? They are given legitimacy in the mainstream of Indian politics in a way that they never had before.
This was a fascinating discussion, and we look forward to your book. When would that?
Well, I'm hoping to sort of finish it in the next few months. Okay. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And keep a lookout for more podcasts from The Hindu.